We are Group 6, and our project is about the country of Belarus. A quick summary before we get started. First, we will be discussing democracy in Belarus and the current administration's human rights violations. Second, we'll discuss the economic systems of Belarus. Third, the economic relationships between Belarus, the European Union, and Russia. Fourth, competing interests between Russia and NATO and the European Union in Belarus. Fifth, the state agency ties between Russia and Belarus. And sixth, the struggles for leadership and global identity in Belarus. So first, I will be discussing democracy in Belarus and Lukashenko's rule. So Belarus gained independence from the USSR in 1991, and the first presidential election was held in 1994 and won by Alexander Lukashenko. He has also won every election since then, the most recent being this year. And on the right is a graph of the percentage of votes he has allegedly won in every election, because every election since 1994 has also not met international standards for fair and free elections. A lack of separation of powers gives Lukashenko control over the courts, as half of the judges are now appointed by the president. He also used a referendum in 1996 to extend the term limits of presidents and to give himself the power to rule by decree, and another referendum in 2004 to end presidential term limits. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe's 2016 Parliament election results report cites legal framework restrictions, lack of fair media coverage, election commission composition, and lack of transparency as the main sources of election issues. Political opponents are restricted by registration processes, limited campaigning ability, insufficient media coverage, and restricted freedom of assembly, and they are also often forced out of the country into self-imposed exile to protect themselves from threats of harm and or death after elections. And individuals in the press are also prohibited from publicly criticizing the president or the government. The state-controlled media prevents criticism from being published or aired on television, as well as unfair news coverage around elections. And during parliamentary elections, government has only allowed state-controlled radio and television to be broadcast, restricting voter access to information about all candidates. Most countries refuse to recognize Belarus's election results, and protests have erupted in the country following this year's presidential election, where Lukashenko again claimed 80% of the votes. Here are some photos from these protests. The government has a long list of human rights violations. To start, they have the abuse and torture of prisoners by the KGB and other police forces in the country, dangerous prison conditions, and refusal to meet with human rights organizations about their complaints. And there's no right to a fair trial, as prosecutors have power to hold suspects without approval of a judge, and defense lawyers are denied access to files and evidence and not allowed to be present for interrogations or interviews. And there are accounts from released detainees from protests that have told reporters about being kept in a 4-person cell with 60 other people, and how one loaf of bread had to be split between 120 people. The riot police would also put them in stress positions and beat them at night. The photo on the right is a woman holding a picture of a man's injuries from the police. The government also uses wiretapping, video surveillance, a network of informants to invade the privacy of citizens, especially political opponents and civil society leaders. The freedom of expression is also restricted because citizens aren't allowed to publicly criticize the president or government or public issues, and they are restricted from displaying anything that is deemed threatening to the government or public order. Free speech is also restricted because giving information to foreigners deemed false about political, economic, social, military, or the international situation of the country is also prohibited. Censorship of state-sponsored media and intimidation of members of the independent media. It's against the law to publish information from unregistered political parties, trade unions, and NGOs. And the government also issues large fines and prison sentences for defaming or insulting the president, the police, and other pro-Lukashenko politicians. And the government restricts access to international media and harasses and detains independent journalists. The photo on the right is of a reporter being detained by the police, and that headline reads, "Police detain at least 17 journalists covering protests in support of opposition candidates," and that is from June of this year. There's also restriction of workers' rights, because major restrictions are placed on unions, which inhibits the right to association and collective bargaining. There's also forced labor. It's against the law, but not strongly enforced, and some people are actually sentenced to medical labor camps. And there's also rampant employment discrimination. Freedom of assembly is restricted. It's protected by law, but heavily restricted and regulated by the government. There's intimidation, threats, requirement of permits, fines, and other methods used to suppress the freedom of assembly. Education is also heavily regulated by the government. It requires the teaching of official state ideology, which includes the praise of former Soviet Union achievements and Belarus under Lukashenko's rule, and schools are not allowed to employ members of the oppositional party. The manipulation of democracy and human rights violations are cause for concern for the European Union and the United States. Many countries want to address the issues in, quote-unquote, Europe's last dictatorship, but Russia has told European Union members not to interfere. The photo on the bottom right is Alexander Lukashenko and Vladimir Putin, and then the left is a news screen cap of the European Union deciding not to recognize the results of Belarus's most recent election.
Hi, my name is Griffin Cole, and I'll be talking about the economic system of Belarus. The economic system of Belarus has been described as market socialism. This kind of sounds like a vague and very paradoxical term. However, we think this lends itself to the idea that Belarus's economy is mixed, and they still have some Soviet-era planned economy relics, as well as privatization happening in more recent years. The two main sectors of the Belarusian economy are manufacturing and agriculture. So their major exports include heavy machinery, which we'll discuss on the next slide, petroleum products, as well as cranberries and sugar beets. So the GDP of Belarus is around 63 billion, and the GDP per capita is 6,713. This is about middle of the road, not extremely high, not extremely low, almost what is expected from a country the size of Belarus. So because of the recession due to COVID-19, a 2.8% contraction is expected in the economy for the current year, which is no surprise. As we know, many countries have struggled with the effects of COVID-19. Another quick thing to note here is Belarus is a member of the Eurasian Economic Union, which includes a lot of Soviet bloc era countries. So Belarus is in this union with Russia, Armenia, Kyrgyzstan, as well as Kazakhstan. On this slide, we're going to talk about these state-owned enterprises. So these state-owned enterprises have often been criticized by the West because of not opening it up post-Soviet collapse. This is a valid criticism. However, there have been some benefits of state-owned enterprises such as Minsk Tractor Works, which is pictured in the bottom right. And one of these benefits has been believed to be the fact that by not allowing people who with mass amounts of capital and money to buy these enterprises post-Soviet collapse, they have not allowed an oligarchy to form, as in many countries, when these industries opened up to private purchase, the people who purchased these have now accumulated massive political and economic power and are able to not only dictate price, but also dictate policy that benefits their company. The social services that also have come in tandem with these state-owned enterprises have also believed to contribute to the very low percent of the population that is living in the World Bank definition of poverty, which should be noted. The World Bank definition of poverty, which is given here in the slide, is, as you can tell, very low. So this may be expected for most developed countries, but it's also believed the fact that they have this infrastructure with these social services being built into these state-owned enterprises has contributed to this low percentage. While there is a good portion of the Belarusian economy that's state-owned, on this slide we're going to talk about the private enterprises, which have now become the largest player in the economy, with around 50% of the economy being privately owned. Because many industries remain state-owned post-Soviet Union, entrepreneurs in Belarus had to basically start from scratch in industries that were up and coming, such as information technology. However, what should be noted is this gradual privatization in Belarus has caused slow growth in its economy by not fully converting to a private economy all the way. They've not grown as rapidly as some of their counterparts have. But, we talked about this earlier. This may have come with its own benefits, though, by not allowing oligopolies and oligarchies to form in Belarus. But what should also be noted is that the Belarusian state relies heavily on crude oil subsidies from Russia for prosperity. And this may be hurt here soon, as Russia is planning to start taxing Belarusian crude oil that's coming into their country. So what IP perspectives are at play in Belarus? The remnants of Soviet, style planned enterprise would point to a structuralist perspective. However, even though we wouldn't consider their overall economy liberal, they have had a liberal handling of new enterprises with offering very little regulation and allowing entrepreneurs to kind of start from the ground up and be in this very competitive environment, such as information technology. And then there's even some aspects of mercantilism, as they rely on Russia to subsidize their crude oil that's coming into Russia in order to help their economy, so that they look favorably compared to other imports of oil in Russia. So I guess this is the kind of question that you can save for later, but I think this is something to note and kind of keep in mind is, so from information given to you and the information that's being given to you throughout the rest of the slides, what perspective do you think sticks out for you the most? And as I say this, I will be done with my part, and I will hand it off to Bo.
Thanks for that, Griffin. And as you guys can see here, my next bit of slides will be about Belarus and its economic relations with other countries, in specific Russia and the European Union. So as we get into it here, dating back to the days of the Soviet Union, Belarus relied heavily on the Soviet Union for a large part of their trade and GDP, stuff that was being brought into the country. And today it has changed a little bit. Trade with Russia accounts for still 48% roughly of the overall trade Belarus has with outside nations. Starting recently, though, Belarus has been having trouble coming to a trade agreement with Russia. They want to become a more independent nation and almost not really sever ties, but just try to be self-reliant more and not rely on Russia for as much trade as they have in the past. And that brings us to today in 2020. Russia and Belarus, the economic ties have been lessening, as I mentioned, because of the inability to agree on trade terms, but we won't see an obvious shift just within the last year. We're going to have to keep watching it and see what happens in Belarus as tensions are continuing. As you can see here, my pictures I put up on the right, there's a sign out in one of the Belarus protests. The man's holding up a sign that says, "Mr. Putin, Belarusians are not Russians." This is in conjugation with the way that Russia has almost tried to force their trade on Belarus. And as I just talked about, Belarus is trying to break apart from that. And as you can see, this picture down at the bottom here, it shows the most trade Belarus has, and just in ties in general, Russia is right up there, number one with Belarus. Belarus's economic relations with Europe. Like I just had talked about, Belarus has been trading more with the EU, and this is showing in trends within the past year. Although never showing interest in joining the European Union, Belarus has been strengthening ties and trade with the EU in recent years, especially in 2020. In regards to overall trade and the Belarusian economy, the European Union is only second to Russia, accounting for about 1/3 or 33% of trade into Belarus. And as of February 2016, the European Union has lifted a majority of trade barriers it previously imposed on Belarus, along with Belarus joining the Eastern Europe Energy Efficiency and Environment Partnership in June of 2017. So what the future will hold for the Belarusian economy. Like I said, although we can't see how the future will play out, we can just try to make very general predictions. And as we see by these lessened trade barriers that the EU has imposed on Belarus, we can just see the shift kind of moving towards the European Union rather than trying to rely on Russia for everything. Like I said, the 48% of overall trade going to Russia. So we can see in the future a possibility of mending and strengthening ties with the European Union and lessening the ties with Russia. And I think personally it would be a smart move for Belarus to align with Europe more, but only time will tell if they can fully break from Russia and become independent.
Good afternoon, my name is Ian Ward, and I'm going to be talking to you about the strategic importance of Belarus and the mobilization in response to current election tensions going on there. First off, Belarus is a buffer between NATO and Russia. It's been that way since the Cold War. Them along with many other nations that are currently NATO nations like Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, even Ukraine, a lot of those nations helped Russia to push their border a lot further west than historically has been, and this is an attempt to prevent any aggression coming from the west that Russia's had to historically deal with. Belarus is also a defensive ally of Russia. Currently, they both have integrated military systems and training and they quite frequently get together and carry out training exercises in not just in Belarus, but in Russia too, and on other frontiers that Russia has with NATO allies and maybe not so friendly adversaries. Belarus has always been a historical highway for military forces traveling back and forth between east and west. If you wanted to go east or if you wanted to go west, you had to go through this Poland, Belarus, Ukraine sort of highway. And the reason for this being is there's not very many geographical obstacles in this area. Whereas to the south, there's more mountainous terrain and there's large bodies of water in the area. This area where Belarus and Poland and Latvia and Lithuania has served as sort of a natural highway for forces to travel on. So if you wanted to push into Russia, you're going to need to go through Belarus and even probably Ukraine and some of these areas. Belarus also has good agricultural lands and industrial complex. They produce a lot of food, and they can help produce military equipment and other things that might be important to Russia if they were ever to face military aggression from whether it be NATO or some other foreign entity. Belarus also serves as a supply hub for energy and different other logistics needs, moving consumer goods or food, equipment, anything you're going to be doing where you want to move into Russia or into NATO. Just like it was a historical highway for the military, it is as well for goods and energy. There's a lot of pipelines in Belarus that help pump oil and natural gas into Europe. Russia supplies about a quarter of NATO or Western Europe's energy needs through pipelines such as this. And this is very important to not only Belarus but to Russia. Whoever controls these pipelines essentially controls not just the energy that is with it, but the money that's associated with this as well. Mobilization response to current tensions. Russia and Belarus, since about the Cold War and even beyond, they've maintained relatively stable, good relationships between each other. Russia and Belarus have integrated defense systems and plans. And even though they may not always see eye to eye and always be super close, Russia and Belarus sort of work together in a lot of ways with the idea that NATO is a bigger threat to them than they are to each other. So they regularly carry out military exercises and operations with each other on the right. You can see current or ongoing or even planned military exercises that have been going on or happening or will happen from about August to about October time frame and beyond. These are areas where Russia and Belarus work together and participate in military exercises together. And you can see that you have Moldova, and all these Russian military exercises. Some of them are happening in disputed territories and even in Belarus. Belarus, in response to some of the sanctions and backlash that's been coming from NATO, has been conducting military operations and mobilization along its border with Poland, which is a NATO member. There's currently Russian troops in Belarus. Current reportings putting this at maybe a couple battalions, really just like airborne units or other units that are effective in training exercises and can be moved around quickly. U.S. and NATO sanctions, because of the ongoing election tensions and accused fraud and the failed transition of power in Belarus, the U.S. and NATO have placed sanctions on individuals. In Belarus, there isn't any current reporting suggesting that they're either mobilizing or planning any of their own counter-military operations in response to this sort of almost passive-aggressive response by Russia and Belarus. They're currently taking a more diplomatic approach with sanctions in the hopes that maybe that'll pressure individuals to change the situation in Belarus.
Russian and Belarusian state agency ties. So Russia and Belarus have a long history of integration and commingling and other forms of interaction. The Union State Treaty of 1999 was one of the most influential treaties in the relationship between the two states. It integrated the two states but ensured that Belarus maintained its sovereignty, its territorial integrity, constitutions, and other characteristics of statehood. The treaty implied close cooperation in foreign policy and defense forces, as well as future united parliament. So it was a close relationship between the two. However, the sovereignty was supposed to be maintained. A forced unionization was explicitly prevented in the treaty, which was positive for Belarus. However, in modern day, restrictions of the treaty are beginning to evaporate as Russia begins to infringe upon many of the restrictions of the treaty. Russia claims that preferential oil and gas treatment to Belarus warrants privilege of full integration, which worries many folks that Russia is starting to infringe upon too many restrictions and will occupy Belarus in the future. Russian leverage in the form of oil and gas industry births the fear that Belarus will concede sovereignty to Russia. And Russia and Belarus are also closely tied in their nuclear power industries, increasing the risk of volatility in their relationship and making the implications of any turmoil more global. Both nations are members of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which many of the previous satellite states in Eastern Europe are a part of. Their borders were shut down as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. This fueled tensions between the two nations regarding their respective responses. They blame one another for the effects of the pandemic, and neither is conceding. So currently the tensions are high between the two states, especially as a result of the Belarusian presidential election and Russia's part to play in that.
Belarus's recent economic struggles. High dependence on exports to Russia and EU has led to economic disparity amidst the COVID-19 pandemic. It is especially fascinating to witness a country attempt to gain liberation from its current government during a pandemic. History has shown how difficult it is just to affect change as a people versus the government. And so we can only imagine the added difficulties that come with the COVID-19 pandemic and what it means to that specific protest. For example, COVID-19 has drastically limited global supply chain and imposed many restrictions on goods going in and out of the countries. Due to the comparative advantages of trade, countries like Belarus rely on exporting goods to countries in the EU and Russia. And so the pandemic, more than anything, has exposed the dependency issues of Belarus in its struggles for liberation and has shined a light on the economic struggles of Belarus altogether. What I mean by that is there are outstanding loan repayments that are required by Belarus to countries like Russia, and this hurts Belarus's financial capacity to combat economic impacts of COVID-19. And so it becomes kind of a snowball where they don't have money and they need to pay money, and because of that, they're losing more money. The trade infrastructure in Belarus was already weak, and the pandemic has since diminished reserves that would have helped alleviate the burden of outstanding loans. For example, as of September 2020, Belarus's hard currency reserves have fallen by 16% since June, and about $3 billion in debt obligations are still needed to be met by the end of this year. Unfortunately, this means that Belarus and the people of Belarus are quite afraid of the motivation with which Lukashenko is protesting back against them or attempting to hold his government. Belarus's leadership. Alexander Lukashenko. We've already mentioned Lukashenko, but I want to quickly refresh. The importance of Lukashenko cannot be understated in this situation because he is the linchpin that is holding the current government together. Lukashenko is the Russian-backed leader who massively falsified the 2020 elections to maintain power in Belarus. And with his victory in the elections, it is clear that the falsification of 2020 elections was in favor of Russia. As mentioned before, Russia has significant financial interest in Belarus, and it is to their benefit for Lukashenko to become president. However, the EU has recently, as early as Monday morning actually, recognized this issue and agrees to target Lukashenko by widening sanctions extending into Belarus. Ultimately, this will serve to support anti-government protests in Minsk, and nobody is happier than Svetlana T. She's the opposition leader who actually won the 2020 election according to statistics revealed by rebel polling stations. The previously mentioned news comes as a result of Svetlana's constant efforts to get the EU involved. The single most important goal for the protesters in Belarus was to gain this recognition from the EU during their protests. And so for many months, for whatever reason, the EU refused to cooperate, but recently it seems to have had a change of heart. And so it'll be interesting to see how the coming weeks play out with further involvement by the EU, because leadership will directly reflect the IP intentions of Belarus moving forward. And in addition to that, it'll also be interesting to see kind of what the U.S. elections hold for the future of Belarus and where our priorities lie in terms of how we want to get involved, if we want to get involved at all. Belarus's global identity. Protesters in Belarus are fighting to secure long-term freedoms. They have spent the previous 26 years under Lukashenko's reign, and they don't foresee themselves being able to cooperate with the government in that fashion for much longer. Protesters seek to develop a national identity through democracy, and so they're really trying to restore the power back to the people. And Belarus currently and this is because Belarus currently concedes global identity to Russia, and that's for many reasons, especially the outstanding loans that they still need to pay back to Russia, but also it's due to the proximity of this superpower. Just imagine a country like Belarus, as small as it is, being neighbors with a superpower like Russia, with the resources like Russia, who already has interest in the government with Lukashenko. It becomes very difficult as the people of Belarus to have any words in edgewise when it comes to your government. And so the EU has imposed sanctions on Belarus to combat Russian interests, and it'll be interesting to see how that progresses forward and what those sanctions really mean, because as of right now, the news is just too fresh to really understand what those sanctions mean and what the impacts of those sanctions will be. And ultimately, it's been incredibly inspiring to follow this story because I've seen multiple headlines and news articles of thousands of people showing up for protests as recently as yesterday, despite warnings of open fire on protesters by legal authority. And with that, in conclusion, Belarus is ultimately just striving towards becoming a globally recognized democracy with fair and free elections and limited economic constraints from outside countries, so that the people can make their own decisions moving forward in the long run.
And that wraps up our presentation on Belarus, Group 6. And here are just our lists of cited sources that we used to put this presentation together.